this event is really a great collaboration that we've had for now the second time with Hudson Valley Bookstore and the Bitter Melon. So the Bitter Melon, just as some background, is basically a platform for our Asian American teens in Westchester County to be able to explore our own history as Americans of Asian descent. One of the projects is the World War II incarceration camps of Japanese Americans, and Amy and Sarah have worked very hard on this presentation by interviewing and getting vetted their presentation, their research that they've done, and this is their second time presenting, so I think it's become very refined. Some of you remember that they presented back in December of 2022, and Kenji was supposed to come at that time, wasn't able to make it, and David Sakura, who ended up zooming in, was actually a survivor of the same camp of Minidoka. So it was such an amazing event to have David Sakura and Kenji Ima, and then we also had another woman who is a Japanese American who grew up in New York City, Suki Terada Ports, also here. It was just a really, really phenomenal time, and so we decided that the best we can, we would like to try to have these events where we can have these voices that are not really shared in the mainstream, it's not taught in school, and our students who really are so passionate be able to tell the story of our history as Asian Americans. So without further ado, I present Amy and Sarah.
I'm Amy. And I'm Sarah. And today we'll be your presenters regarding the history around Japanese American concentration camps. So first, I'd like to start by reading a dedication of the residents at the Minidoka Relocation Center at Hunt, Idaho. So this is just a reminder that when they wrote this dedication, it was in the middle of when they were living in those concentration camps, and they had no idea about what their future would be or what their next steps would be. We, as residents of the Minidoka Relocation Center at Hunt, Idaho, take pleasure in dedicating this book to the America of tomorrow and reaffirm our faith in the principles and ideals of the founders of the United States. In dedicating this book to the greater America to come, when victory has been won over the forces of aggression and greed, it is our firm conviction that a nation so great, so powerful, and so wise, whose very foundation of government and principles of living is based on equality and justice, will solve her domestic racial problems in a just and equitable manner. This America, whose greatest strength is the determination of her people to uphold the democratic principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, will stand as a shining example to all the world in demonstrating that the people of all nations, all races, and all colors can live happily together, united by a bond of mutual respect, true understanding, and love of freedom.
We have every confidence that this nation of ours will lead the way toward a post-war peace, which will bring to all everlasting security based upon those principles of freedom, equality, justice, and humanity, which so many of our sons and brothers are fighting and dying to uphold. May we dedicate this book to the land of the free and the home of the brave, where the Star-Spangled Banner shall wave in triumph, to a truly free and democratic America, where men shall be judged by their actions, not by their race, color, or creed. To our homeland, and the homeland of our children, the United States of America.
So now just to get into a little bit of the table of contents of what we're talking about today, we're going to give you some context for the event, then we're going to talk about the actual Japanese concentration camps themselves, then we're going to discuss life in the camps, and then what happened afterwards to the people who were incarcerated. So, beginning with context, so significant Japanese immigration started around the 19th century. So there were adverse economic conditions in Japan, and there were a lot of rumors spreading or reports about the better economic status in the United States. The United States was like the land of gold, where everyone wanted to come and live a better life. So around 70% of Japanese immigrants actually lived in California. After their major immigration, anti-Japanese groups and legislation were created. They were excluded from political, social, economic affairs. They were a major target of California's politics, which means that most politicians were actually attacking them instead of protecting them. Local labor groups with major anti-Japanese projects were created, and there were a lot of protests to reenact the Chinese Exclusion Act, but with all Mongolian labor. So pretty much just getting rid of all Japanese immigrants. So pretty much with these anti-Japanese sentiments, there were a lot of efforts to prohibit land ownership by Japanese immigrants. Most of them were actually farmers, so this was very harsh measures. This was just an effort to get them to leave the country. Eventually, future land purchased by non-US citizens were barred or banned. This was the most restrictive land law ever passed, and it was supported by a variety of groups, including the Native Sons of the Gold West, the American League, etc.
Now, anti-Japanese sentiments were very prevalent in the media, and there was a lot of negative portrayal through newspapers, movies, etc., as you can see in this poster up here, actually. And there were also delegates from 67 organizations who actually met to form the Japanese Exclusion League, which essentially just wanted Japanese exclusion. And they used legislation, boycotting, and propaganda to do this. And this group grew to such an extent that by 1908, they had over 100,000 members and 238 affiliated groups, all supporting this goal of Japanese exclusion. There's also lots of segregation targeted towards those Japanese descent, such as removing Japanese students to an Oriental school. And you can see here that there's this sign, again, trying to segregate and discriminate against Japanese Americans. Now, the Japanese Exclusion League actually said, "Our children should not be placed in any position where their youthful impressions may be affected by association with peoples of the Mongolian race," showing just how extreme this prejudice towards Japanese Americans was.
Now to get into the 5 goals of California, these are the 5 political goals that they had towards Japanese Americans. The first one was the cancellation of the Gentleman's Agreement. The Gentleman's Agreement was created to ease political tension, and they wanted to cancel this in order to increase the tensions. Second, they wanted prohibition against further immigration from Japan. So they pretty much wanted all Japanese immigrants to stop being allowed to come in. One of their main focuses was prohibition against the entry of picture brides. Picture brides is pretty much when women marry based on the recommendation of a matchmaker, so they exchange photos of the bride and the husband. They wanted to stop this in order to stop people from immigrating to the United States. Third, they wanted a policy that Asians should be forever barred from American citizenship. So that means that no matter what they do, they will never be allowed to be a citizen of the United States. And finally, they wanted an amendment of the federal Constitution to provide that no child born in the United States should become an American citizen unless both parents were of a race eligible for citizenship. Which pretty much means that even if children were born from Japanese immigrants, they still would not be allowed to be citizens. And furthermore, regarding the Munson Report, and just to give a little context, the Munson Report was done prior to the Pearl Harbor bombing. This was an intelligence report done on the Japanese Americans on the West Coast by Munson, who was a businessman. And this was pretty much commissioned by the state because they wanted more intel on the Japanese Americans. So what he did is he just stayed a week in different districts on the West Coast to gain information. He interviewed many Japanese Americans, got their side of the story, and his conclusion was that Japanese Americans presented no security risk. They had no loyalty to Japan, and they were foreigners pretty much. So his conclusion was that they were no risk and they were pretty much citizens of the United States. However, this whole report was ignored as the president wanted a better state of intelligence as the state of the United States and Japan's relationship deteriorated. So despite the fact that they already said that they were no threats, they decided to ignore a report that they were the ones that they did and just continue on with their discrimination.
And now we're going to move on into the actual event. So this is essentially a timeline, and we'll be starting at December 7th, where there was a Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, the effects of Pearl Harbor were immediate and extreme. This killed, of course, 2,403 Americans, and this led to U.S. entry into World War II, showing us how pivotal it was. Further, due to the surprising nature of the attack, paranoia and fear began to spread throughout the U.S., and paired with the propaganda and discrimination against Japanese Americans prior to this, is combined into anti-Japanese sentiment that evolved into full-blown suspicion and paranoia that was completely unjust. There was also a large presence of Japanese Americans on the West Coast, which was seen as a security risk, despite, as Amy said before, there was really no risk associated with this. There was also lots of suspicion that Japanese Americans were remaining loyal to Japan. And as you can see here, these are newspapers discussing this. Now the media began to perpetuate the paranoia and fear seen, with the Los Angeles Times stating, "A viper is nonetheless a viper wherever the egg is hatched." So a Japanese American, born of Japanese parents, grows up to be a Japanese, not an American. This is essentially saying that all Japanese are foreigners, and that they are still loyal to Japan and not America, even though almost all Japanese Americans in the US had never even been to Japan. Now the FBI began to target Japanese Americans only hours after Pearl Harbor, specifically targeting men and community and religious leaders. Now they rounded up about 1,291 Japanese Americans, and this list of people was actually compiled before the bombing, showing how there was prejudice even before all this happened. They were arrested with all their assets frozen and transferred to camps without being able to inform their families, which were separated for years. When you look at this photograph right here, one person actually, Tatsuo Ichikawa, was picked up by the FBI in April 1942 and was separated from his family for 2 years before they were reunited at another concentration camp. Now, many of these Japanese Americans that were seized also had their homes searched, and many of these items were determined contraband and taken away from them. Now, in Issei, a Japanese immigrant man who was picked up by the FBI because he was a community leader said, "I bid farewell to the faces of my sleeping children, as I am taken prisoners into the cold night rain. There is no fence high up in the sky. The evening crows into the endless horizon."
Now to get into the second event, on February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt signs the Executive Order 9066, allowing the removal of any person by the military. So the Executive Order 9066 is, despite disagreeing that any person could be removed by the military and isolated, this was clearly targeted towards Japanese Americans. And the thing that most people don't know is that internationally, a lot of other nations followed suit with America. So Canada and Mexico also had concentration camps where they incarcerated their Japanese descendants as well. Canada itself removed 21,000 of its residents off the coast, and Mexico removed around 2,264 people. So clearly, America was also setting some sort of example to the rest of the world. So John DeWitt was actually the leader of the Western Defense Committee, and he was established for protection of the Pacific Coast specifically, and he was the one who suggested that we create military zones. So he actually originally planned to detain Italians, Germans, and Japanese because a lot of immigrants were coming from those places at the time, but rounding up Americans of European descent were not popular. So instead, because anti-Japanese sentiments were already common, he actually used this for his own agenda. And since there was no public complaint against rounding up Japanese Americans, he pretty much began to use this for his own plan. And he actually created reports filled with falsehoods, such as saying that they were sabotaging the army, when in fact later on it was just cattle damaging power lines. This is actually a quote that he said himself: "The Japanese race is an enemy race."
Now we're moving on to looking at the actual establishment of the relocation of Japanese Americans and these relocation centers, which were where Japanese Americans were located right before they went to concentration camps. Now, the War Relocation Authority was what essentially oversaw the plans to administer the relocation of Japanese Americans. And this was led by Eisenhower, but he resigned in protest because he believed they were incarcerating innocent people, which they were. Racist resistance from state governments who ran the states that camps were located in was also prevalent, because they were fearful that the Japanese would quote on never leave and hope that they'd be locked up instead, even though these were simply just innocent people.
So finally, March 24, 1942, the first civilian exclusion order is issued and families are given only 1 week to prepare for removal from their homes. So evacuation. Anyone with 1/16 of Japanese blood was to be evacuated. 17,000 children were. Several thousand elderly and disabled were, and 2/3 of these people evacuated were American citizens. The worst part was families received only 6 days to notice to dispose of all their belongings outside of what they could carry, which is just a small bag. Unsure of when or if they would ever return, they had to sell their homes, their businesses and assets, at a fraction of what they were worth due to the urgency, which is why later on, after these camps were ended, as you'll see later, a lot of them struggled in repicking back up their lives. So here are just a few photos. You can see that really they did not have much space at all in order to bring their belongings, so everything else they had to get rid of. And you can see that there's a lot of panic and urgency and desperation because they don't know where they're going or what's going to happen to them. So here is a quote from an old farmer. "They took my boy to the army, and now they take my other children to a concentration camp." This is just a reminder that these people were innocent, that they'd given a lot to America only to be casted aside as foreigners and enemies.
And now in this picture here, this sign was placed outside of a Japanese American-owned store after the orders were put out for Japanese Americans to evacuate. The owner of the store was actually eventually put into a concentration camp. Now, they were now relocated to assembly centers, which was a step before being relocated to concentration camps. In these assembly centers, they were going through incredibly terrible conditions that were completely unsuitable for human habitation. They were put into horse stalls and cow sheds, and there were lots of food shortages in these assembly centers and an overall lack of sanitation, resulting in conditions that were unjust for any human to live in. 3,000 people actually lived in a livestock pavilion in Oregon, and at the Santa Anita Assembly Center, 8,000 people lived in horse stalls with dirt floors, and riots actually broke out due to the insufficient rations and the overcrowding.
So regarding these assembly centers, work was offered to the evacuees, but they were paid relatively little, if anything at all. There were doctors, teachers, factory workers, and seasonal farmers. From these assembly centers, you see that the Japanese Americans would then be transferred on to the actual concentration camps.
Now we're going to be talking about the life in the camps. Now here are the geographic locations of the camps seen here. And most of these were actually put on the west coast with a little more influence. There were a total of 10 camps in all. Now in these camps, several families were squeezed into small barracks, which was completely overcrowded and just not just for anyone to live in. And these were incredibly unsuitable homes because they were uninsulated. And as I said before, they were on the interior of the United States, surrounding the Rocky Mountains and other overall unsuitable conditions. And with uninsulated homes, this only resulted in extremely hot and or cold weather for these people to suffer through. These homes were really only furnished with cots or coal-burning stoves, which did not really supplement the heat needed for people to survive in the cold weather mentioned. People would share facilities of bathrooms, laundry, and mess halls, and there were overall very limited resources, with little hot water and food shortages were very awful. There was also inadequate medical care and aid, and as a result, there was a lot of poor sanitation and many illnesses arising in these camps, and some people actually did die from these. The Japanese Americans were also constantly surrounded by barbed wire fences and by guards patrolling the camps, and these guards were actually under orders to shoot anyone that tried to leave. And here's just an image of the barracks. And here are some images of inside the concentration camps, what it was like for them. And as you can see, there are all these barbed wire fences and they're overcrowded.
So these actual lives in the camps, despite having all of these hardships, Japanese Americans were able to build up communities and towns within these concentration camps. So what you see is that there were a lot of institutions like schools, councils, churches, farms, newspapers, fire and police departments. High school students still had bands, sports teams, clubs, senior prom, etc. And children were still able to play sports and do arts and crafts.
Now, there was a loyalty test administered in 1943 for the Japanese Americans. And in this loyalty test, they were essentially asked to reject allegiance to the Japanese emperor and assert where they were willing to serve in the U.S. military. Now, it must be said that this is incredibly unfair, as the Japanese Americans have already been interned in these concentration camps for several years. And the U.S. government didn't trust them so much, they put them in these camps. So to be asked this loyalty test was of course something that many were against. This resulted in these no-no boys who said no to both these questions, which was a completely reasonable response after they had been mistreated to such an extent by their own government. These no-no boys were sent to Tule Lake, which is an incredibly vicious and cruel environment, where they endured inhumane conditions there, in which tanks would be patrolling on the perimeters of the camp, and there were many guards armed outside. On the other hand, there were others that enlisted into armed forces to prove they're innocent, with 32,000 Nisei men serving, some in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which is now known as the most decorated unit of its size in U.S. history.
So regarding violence and human rights violations, obviously there was a lot of abuse, there was exploitation, there was a lack of resources, and we just pulled here a few examples of the hundreds. Within the New Mexico camps, prisoners were delivered in trains and forced to march 2 miles at night to reach the camp. 2 elderly disabled Japanese Americans were shot and killed. Guards claimed that they were attempting to escape, but testimonies were given that the 2 men weren't trying to escape and were merely doing what they were told. In the Topaz Relocation Center, a 63-year-old prisoner was shot and killed for merely walking near the perimeter of the fence and was not even trying to escape. And a different couple was shot for strolling near the fence as well. So clearly what we can see is that they're using violence for no reason and these people are just doing what they are told and they're innocent. Furthermore, in a different relocation center, 6 white men beat to death the Japanese American Citizen League leader. Later on, a different Japanese American was actually blamed for the assault despite being innocent. Then the police tear gassed the crowd that came to demand his release. James Ito and others were actually wounded, and some actually died later due to complications. So not only were many of them innocent, they were actually scapegoats for many of the other issues, and then were then blamed and later on punished. Furthermore, finally we have the segregation center. Protests and strikes over food shortages and unsafe conditions broke out, which was completely reasonable due to the inhumane conditions that they were living in, but a lot of these protesters were actually killed by guards or beaten. Furthermore, if you were to show any type of resistance, you would be forced to stand outdoors for hours in snowy conditions in very bare clothing. Now, as Sarah said before, these places were extremely cold, and really, in order to be standing outside in snowy conditions for hours, that is pretty much just torture. Furthermore, an infant actually fell into scalding water or boiling water, and they refused to take the child out of the concentration camp to a hospital, and that child later died. So clearly they did not care at all for these innocent civilians. These civilians, they pretty much just saw as animals. Overall, 1,862 people died, mostly due to health and complications exacerbated by the malnutrition in facilities that lacked proper protection. And on the East Coast, there were some people who moved to camps on the East Coast of America, but majority were primarily under house arrest. So while there were some camps, most of it was just house arrest. They weren't allowed to leave their homes at all, and they relied on the government to supply them with food, water, medications. However, government officials would often just forget those under house arrest, and they would go days without supplies.
And now we'll be talking about what happened after the concentration camps. Now, in the end, 127,000 people were imprisoned in concentration camps for 3 or more years until the end of the day. And here we want to stress that these people didn't know how long they were going to be in these conditions. They didn't know how long they were suffering. They didn't know what was happening to them. And at the time, all this was incredibly unknown, and therefore there was extreme fear amongst them. Now, in the redress movement, this is essentially the efforts to obtain restitution of civil rights and an apology, as well as compensation from the U.S. government. Early campaigns essentially emphasized the violation of constitutional rights in these camps, the lost property, and the repeal of anti-Japanese legislation. These activists linked the wartime detention camps to contemporary racist and colonial policies, and later campaigns included 3 organizations pursuing freedom of war crimes, and thankfully this finally led to reparations.
Now, regarding the actual reparations, the last camp closed in March 1946. President Gerald Ford officially repealed Executive Order 9066 in 1976, and finally, in 1988, Congress issued a formal apology. Civil Liberties Act of 1988 pretty much said that $20,000 each would be given to over 80,000 Japanese for the treatment that they endured, but that was very little to what they lost. So, life after the camps, many of them were unable to reclaim old homes, and they had to often live in federal government open areas for Japanese Americans. So overall, they lost 75% of their property. There was still a lot of fear of violence and discrimination towards Japanese Americans. There were a lot of stereotypes that were running rampant at this time, and as a result, unfortunately, suicide rate among those held in the camps jumped by as much as 4 times pre-war levels. So you can see the huge impact that this had on their mental health. Many of them were unable to recover financially, and economic losses were estimated to be as high as $6.2 billion. Residents lost about $400 million in property after being put within those concentration camps. So here's a quote from a Japanese American who was struggling with their mental health at the time. But when we came out of camp, that's when I realized that being in camp, that being Japanese American was something shameful. This is what happened. This is what they began to think about themselves. They began to hate themselves even though they were innocent due to the actions and suspicions from the government and of other citizens in the United States.
Now, after the camps, many had applied for expatriation or repatriation to Japan due to the stressors mentioned before. And as a result, 8,000 of them left the country. But in Japan, they didn't fare much better, as they were complete foreigners there. Many of them didn't know the language, and Japan itself was suffering after World War II due to the atomic bombs as well as other factors from the war. And therefore, they were completely ostracized there as well. Also, there was a complete lasting economic impact of the internment or concentration camps on the Japanese Americans, as seen here. Because even in 1980, 35 years after their release, Japanese Americans who were placed in the forest camps still earned much less. And also, Issei were completely unable to find work, as they had now been out of the workforce for so long and were now too old to find any work to support their still young families.
And here is the final quote that we found from someone unknown. To you, it was a history story. To me, it was my life. I think this serves as an important reminder of why we need to keep educating ourselves and learning more about these events. And now we're going to introduce to you.
I'm going to emphasize a few things that affected me personally. Most people can't even remember the Depression, let alone World War II. The Depression was very difficult for everyone. In Madison Square Garden in 1939,
I'm going to give you a mic.
in 1939, at the in New York, 8,000 Americans showed up at the at an event sponsored by a pro-German organization called the Bund. It emulated the Nazis. But there was a great, if you will, movement to support the Nazi regime, even in America. Now, during the 30s, Germany went to war and surprisingly became well-to-do. They were well-fed. It looked like they conquered the Depression. So many Americans, including isolationists, felt that Germany provided a solution to the Depression. And if you read the events of World War II, Poland, France, the British troops were at Dunkirk. They could have been slaughtered if it weren't for, if I can put it this way, an inappropriate military decision. They could have wiped them out. But as you know, the English sent boats to recover the troops. It was very significant. Still in America, well, let me put it this way. Not only do they despise the Japanese, blacks were on the list. Even, you know, Jews. There was a lot of anti-Semitism which showed up when the ship of fools landed in Cuba, and they couldn't land in the Western Hemisphere. They had to go back to Germany to face death. And then there was the America First organization that not only supported them, but really, let me put it this way, America is for white people, and that sentiment was very deeply felt. You know, the 1930s have not disappeared. It seems for most of you were children, now not children were born way after, but the persistence of, if I can put it this way, racial intimidation persists, even though we say, hey, America is for everyone. It's a place of opportunity. But as you know, there was even a proposition recently that said we shouldn't give citizenship to people born in America because they're likely to be brown. At any rate, it goes on, in which I'd like to suggest we are not in the clear. When history repeats itself in different forms, it is a reminder. And too often we can't remember history. Now, I'll talk about myself as a 4-year-old. On a dark, stormy day in Seattle, I went with my family to the Greyhound. It wasn't a depot, it was by the train station. It was cold, overcast, gloomy. And I'm sat on my mother's lap, not knowing what was going on. But what I sensed was this: fear. Now, from my mother's perspective, the question was, what's going to happen to us? People are inventing this incarceration on the spot. Well, my mother said, well, maybe they'll send us back to Japan. But my mother was born here. I was born here. Well, or maybe they would use us for prisoner exchange. You can hear all the rumors because nothing was certain. And then, you know, the camp. Sure, there was a barbed wire. But you know, when you hear about someone getting shot, well, the barbed wire was around the corner from where I lived. Well, I was, if you will, not enamored with the fence. Stay away from it, because the guns are pointed at us. I mean, there were, okay. Now, after the war, someone asked me, what was it like in camp? I said it was all fun and games. We played, you know, what the child knows. I didn't know anything about the Constitution or violation of rights or anything else like that. We played, and there were all these kids who were, you know, companions that made life interesting. So that's the story I told. And on top of that, my parents used the phrase, "shikatakanai." What does that mean? Well, shikatakanai refers to a difficult situation which you had no control over, but your job is to put up with it. You know, if you complain or something, you know, so from some Japanese point of view, you showed weakness. You showed strength because you endure this. Well, I had difficulty with this idea, but I never talked to my parents about camp because it was sort of not to be talked about. You simply go on. So my interest in camp was not something of my first choice. It was only because my daughter nudged me. You know, she said, "Well, what about camp?" I said, "Well, I don't know, it was okay." You know, and then as we look more carefully at the documents, in fact, it was less than 3 years ago, we were looking at documents that my mother saved, and there in front of us was a picture I drew in camp. And the picture was barbed wire, barracks, guard towers, and of all things, I drew a bomber. Okay, now you can ask, well, so big deal. Unfortunately, I had nightmares that I never told my mother or brother or anybody, because it's part of it is if you have these difficulties, you're simply to put up with it and endure it. So I forgot about it, but what is the dream? I'm on this street. There's this big building. It's dark. There is a humming sound that sounds like war. There's a woman, I can't identify her, but I thought it was my mother. I had this dream repeatedly from the camp until I was maybe 10 or older. But the dream occurred over and over again. And every time I woke up from the dream, I was sweating. But then again, shikatakanai. Don't talk about it. At any rate, I didn't have a vocabulary to remember this. By accident, I married a Jewish woman. Now he said, well, okay, you married a Jewish woman. Well, I was engulfed in this her family. And one thing that struck me was they're always telling stories. Story about Aunt Hilda, Gilda, you know, Golda. And, you know, I listened to these stories. And what struck me was, in Jewish terms, being a witness is fundamental to being Jewish. Well, what are you witnessing? You're witnessing life. You're witnessing, in the case of World War II, the Holocaust. Somebody better be a witness. And I'm thinking to myself, that's not me. But then I thought about it, and through the influence of my wife, you sort of begin to think about stories. And one of the stories was this nightmare. And I didn't fully understand it, but I thought, children remember the craziest things. It was probably a child's imagination. But when I looked at that drawing I had as a child, there it was. The barracks, the hum of war was that airplane, the bomber. And I said to myself, and this is only a few years ago, I think I had what would be called post-traumatic stress. Because it resembled, I interviewed Cambodian women who told me, I have nightmares all the time. And then I'm thinking, okay, we weren't in Cambodia, but this similarity made me think part of what camp was about was a mental health issue. When you're incarcerated, there's no doubt that it is a traumatic experience. And I said to my fellow playmates, it was nothing. But now I come to the conclusion it was something. And so when someone interviewed me about this, and I responded, I think I've become Jewish. Because I'm remembering and lamenting. And now I'm here as a witness. As a child, I was there, but I can't tell you all the details of what an adult would tell you. But this dream was so powerful, I concluded camp was not all joy.
So, Amy and Sarah are going to interview with Kim, who is the daughter of Kenji, and then afterwards we'll have a Q&A, so everyone will have a chance to ask Kenji questions.
Hi, so the first question we have is, how old were you when you were taken, and what were you allowed to bring, if you can remember?
Well, I was 4, and I believe that we were given 2 weeks. And I had no idea what was going on, basically. It was my connection to my mother, who was, I would put it this way, a sensitive woman. And I concluded that her fear affected me, because she didn't know what was going to happen in the future. But she never said, "Oh, Kenji, this is terrible." No, none of that. She, as a mother, she would say, "Oh, everything's going to be okay." But the tension that I could feel was not one of okay. I don't know if I fully answered your question.
So I know you had a teddy bear that you did bring to the camp. Do you connect anything to that teddy bear? Does it still represent anything to you?
Well, I'm a sociologist, and one of the things that I specialized in was immigrants, because I could relate to immigrants and refugees, and I spent a lot of time with Cambodians and Lao and Vietnamese. And in my dealings with them, I went to the school board to make sure the school would take into account what these kids brought to school. And I went to the police department, what they asked me for advice, and community organization, crime, etc. So they established a refugee, if you will, a police outreach. What was I doing? I think I was in part responding to what I would have needed. So, in a manner of speaking, my work is an extension of my own personal story.
Thank you. As a follow-up to that, after the U.S. all got out of the camps, how did your life at home, and as you said before, you guys didn't exactly talk about the camps in your family. How did that affect your own response to the camps, and how did seeing your parents not exactly react to it outright affect you?
You do things that sometimes you don't understand what you're doing. I could immediately feel sympathy for, in this case, the Southeast Asian refugees. I also work with an organization that educates parents of immigrants who have children in school. So, to answer your question, I'm not sure how point A gets to point B, but my involvement in the community reflects, if you will, my concerns that I had as a child. I wish someone would have talked to me. I wish I would have been born a Jew. Because there's a therapeutic element in being Jewish, because after all, what is therapy but talk? And in relationship to what you asked, the connection is clear, but it's sort of happenstance. It just happened. Sometimes an event happens, then you're supposed to respond to it. And that's what I did. And the refugees kept asking me for a favor. Okay, you need a counselor, and you're sending all this material to families who don't read English. Okay, let's get some translation. What I felt was I knew certain things that had to be done, but part of it was motivated by the fact that I experienced camp.
Now, we talked about reparations a bit in our slideshow, so we were wondering, did you and your family ever receive any reparations?
Oh, yes.
So, do you want to talk a bit about that?
Okay, I'll
and if
talk
it
about
really
this. My grandmother had a farm. She had it leased out And when she came back, all the equipment was gone. The taxes were not paid. And in effect, she had the prospect of losing a farm that she and her husband spent many years building. Well, the government said, okay, well, we'll compensate you, but it was like pennies on the dollar. You can't recover the farm. Now, on the other hand, my parents owned a hotel where the customers were primarily, low-income people. And my mother was very smart. She signed a contract with a company that would take care of the hotel. So when we came back, the hotel was there. So on the one hand, it was terrible. On the other hand, it was okay. I mean, in life, it's the details. It varies a lot. And so, well, for example, not all Americans hated us. My grandmother and my family were Baptists. And who should come to camp but the white minister from the church? Not only that, but there was Father Tibisar, the Catholic priest, came from Seattle. And then there were volunteers from various Christian groups to help us. So it wasn't all black and white, but there was some good people. The question I would raise to you is, if you were in the situation outside the camp, what would you do? Because it isn't just my story. I think there's a moral here, is that when people have a need and you can provide some assistance, if you're very religious, obviously, if you're Christian, you're supposed to help. But in all religions, no matter whether Christian or not, there are fundamental moral beliefs that could be summed up by the golden rule.
I was just going to add the question of reparations, though, because I remember that you and Mom had conversations about what to do about that.
Yeah, I didn't want the reparations. I thought it was an insult. That money could never repay the nightmares. I couldn't put a price on it, but they put a price on it, so I stalled. And then finally a friend of mine says, "Oh, get off your high horse, just take the money already." So I gave the money to my children.
And my grandmother had 5 grandchildren, and so she divided it up. And you had to be alive. If someone had been in camp that was no longer alive, the family didn't get anything. It's just anyone who was still alive. So my grandma was still alive, but she gave it to the 5 grandchildren. And so we each had that choice, what do you do with it? And for me personally, the thought was, I want to be able to do something and say, and this is where the money came from. So I waited until there was a time where I could use it for something that I thought was important. Because of I think the example of my father and mother.
Now, about your reintegration into society after the camps, do you remember anything about, for example, what was it like at school, or what was it like for your parents to get back into the workplace and
Okay,
into
well,
society?
Do you want me to hold that?
yeah, no, I'll just say. From a child's point of view, being in camp, you weren't treated as a Jap. The word Jap didn't occur. It was very polite. White teachers, the guards. I have to put it this way. Initially, it was difficult. But after a while, they said, well, why do we have guards? No one's escaping. So they took the guards away. Sometimes you just overdo something. At any rate, the point is, the government was inventing, we were inventing it as we went along. What's next? And so my cousins, who were of college age, went to Minnesota before the closing of the camp. Oh, that's interesting. We could go to Twin Falls, which was a big town nearby, and come back to camp. I mean, it's not like, you're in Sing Sing. There are a lot of subtleties, but the underlying premise was after camp. You are a chap. You are the enemy. So what do other kids know? They only know what's told to them. So, if you will, in a manner of speaking, I was bullied because I was considered the enemy. And one of my now friends beat me up because I'm a chap. And then there's implicit notions of where you should stand. It was a world in which, you're supposed to be, if you go out, you're supposed to be with a Japanese American girl, which I dated. But when I went to college, I realized, gee, there are a lot of interesting people around. And they aren't all Japanese American. In fact, that's where I met my wife. The joy of my life, but she was such a great educator. I learned so much from her, and she was a joy. In the Jewish words, they say, oh, that person's a mensch. She was a mensch. Let's see, I keep getting lost.
Well, so let's have one more question, and then him, if he wants to add something, and then we'll have the audience join in.
So our final question is, what do you want to share with Americans today on race and equality in a general sense?
Did you hear that, Pop?
No.
Oh, what do you want to share with Americans about race and equality?
Oh. All of us have a side of us that are not so great. So you need to be aware of, if you will, the bad boy in you, or the bad girl in you. And we're not perfect. should be treating each other as if we were, if you will, friends, or somehow you're engaging with another person. It's that person's soul that doesn't necessarily have a color. You know, I found myself surprised that I married a Jewish girl, but you know, I married a soulmate. I think one of the things that I learned is that we have too many preconceptions that come from our bad side and not appreciate the person in front of us. You know, it's our preconceptions. Oh, you know, you don't want to. Well, you know, even you know, there are white people that are disrespectful. You know, you say, oh, there are hillbillies, or you know, white trash, or it goes on and on. You know, characterization of other people, but. You know, maybe there are bad people and you don't want to deal with them, but at least get to know who they are before you make too many judgments. Now, I speak from a sort of like a personal level. You know, it's hard for me to talk about the bigger issue, you know, like affirmative action or this or that. Or right now there is a proposal in California, reparations for black people. Well, I think we could have a discussion. You know, so on two levels, one personal level that I just said, but on the larger level, I think we need to encourage our politicians to be more like, I'm not Christian, but to be more like Jesus. And there are a lot of people who say they're pro-Jesus, but gee, they act like the devil.
So Alice suggested that I ask you a question. Alice suggested that I ask you a question.
Oh, okay, I'm ready.
But I feel like a big part of our relationship is asking questions and having conversations, and that we never get to the answers really, or we consider answers, but they're almost like touchstones. They're these conversations that, or mobiles, where they're constantly changing.
Okay, this is my response. Kim insisted that I look into this issue. Okay, I'm ready. You know, she's my daughter. I'll do something. But what I found is that in exploring the topic that she so wanted, was a bonding or a relationship, you know, in these conversations, she understood me, I understood her. And so I'm more, let's say, I'm more bonded to Kim than I was before she asked the question.
So we'll just take, because time, I had no idea this was gonna go so fast. We'll take 2 questions from the audience, if anybody has any questions. All right, can you come up?
Actually, I have more of a comment than a question.
Okay.
I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your story with us, because I think it is so brave of you to do that, and it is through your story and so many people like you who are brave to tell their story, that we, my generation and my children, learn. We learn from books, but more importantly, we learn from people who lived it, who lived the story, who lived the history. And I just want to say thank you for sharing your story and for being so brave.
Anybody else have a question or a comment?
May I add my thanks for the young people who just did a beautiful, beautiful job.
Okay, well, if there are no questions, I would also like to ask, oh, we have a question. Come on over.
Thank you, of course. I don't think I formulated the question fully, but you did allude to Sing Sing, and we are in a prison town, and there are currently 1,200 people incarcerated just down the street. And so I wanted to think about what that means, and so we've come very far in a lot of ways, and also you mentioned that we have so much more work to do, and I guess I just wanted to seek your wisdom about what that looks like. Thank you.
Did you heard Anna?
No,
You didn't hear Anna.
no.
I can repeat it.
Yeah, do it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Kenji.
We're all friends here.
Thank you. That's the main thing. I'm so grateful. And also to see this intergenerational exchange is so incredibly powerful. You mentioned briefly Sing Sing. And I was wondering, we're sitting here in a prison town with 1,200 people just down the street who are incarcerated right now behind barbed wire and watchtowers and concrete cell blocks that are 6 by 9 feet. And I wanted to think about what do we have so much work to do. What does it look like? Considering your history and the history we're living in, the present right now, what does it look like? Just a small question. How do we end mass incarceration? Just a little question. Any wisdom that you have, I'd be grateful for.
Well, if you think about it, all of our lives are busy. We have this request, that request, family members, friends. So the question is, are there things we might do to give gifts to people in need? And obviously, I have a checklist, which I write a check, I give, to different organizations. But that is one way. But it seems to me that if you have a personal connection with somebody, there is a way of providing comfort. Or, in some ways, I'm a professor, so one of the problems I have is to listen to what a student presents to me. So I have to, okay, it isn't about the grade. Oftentimes it's about a problem they have that I can't really, answer. So what I oftentimes do is refer them to an agency that would provide services. I work for this organization, which I'm a board member. It's called PK, Parent Institute for Quality Education. And I work with them because a friend of mine asked me a favor. Can you help us? I said, well, what can I do? Then he introduced me, and I've been on the board for 10 years. Well, it was a personal connection that made it possible, and the recipient, you know, like in this case, parents who don't know much about American education, would bring them up to snuff. How to prepare your child. What is this American system like? You know, like if you're Mexican, your idea is the teacher knows everything, so don't ask any questions. Well, in this school system, if a parent doesn't speak up, inquire, they're likely to be overlooked. So, having engaged parents is my contribution. How maybe another person will ask me another, you know, to help them in another way, and I'll have to think about it, but, you know, the idea of giving, well, it's actually fundamental to the way it was raised, you know, as a Baptist. But in the Jewish tradition, giving is a commandment. So how you work it out individually is your, you know, your solution.
Thank you. Giving and comfort and community. I have to just say that I feel like after this takeaway for me is that as an Asian American, we have to be more like Jewish people. That was my biggest takeaway. That's the
Don't
goal.
worry, Alice, you're a mensch.
Thank you. Thank you. So, thank you all so much for coming. Before we close, Kenji, thank you so much for coming here and the time to speak with all of us, share your story. This is so meaningful and we have it recorded so that we can watch this and show future students. To our students, I just want to say thank you for doing the research and taking the time to meet with the IMA family and making sure that the research was accurate. It's probably one of the most thorough presentations on this topic you'll ever find. So, bravo, thank you so much. Also, before we go, I want you to know that all the work that we do with the Bitter Melon is all, you know, it's volunteer-based and it's all team-powered. It really is. I mean, I do very small work in terms of administrating and mentoring, yada, 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 but a lot of the bulk of the work comes from the students, high school students themselves. And I think that the work that the students are doing and really taking the agency to lead these programs are amazing. So I hope you can come to more Bitter Melon programs and support them. Before we close, I also want to invite a couple of people, because they are in the space of Japanese American identity in the New York area, and there are other events that you can go to become more aware of things that you can become involved in and be an upstander for the community. And so we have the Day of Remembrance. Stan. Oh yes, Stan. That he can quickly tell you about some programs in New York, and then yes, here we
Thanks.
go.
Yeah, my name is Stan Honda, and I'm with the New York City Day of Remembrance program. Kim and I are both on the committee, and every year we put on a program called the Day of Remembrance, and we try to have it around February 19th, which is the anniversary of the day that President Franklin Roosevelt signed the executive order that eventually caused the incarceration of Japanese Americans. So we mark the incarceration with a program, a yearly program, and we're trying to do interesting speakers as well as presentations. We haven't had an in-person program for 2 years, and we're expecting to actually have a gathering next February And we usually gather at the Japanese American United Church on 7th Avenue in Manhattan. We've got an Instagram and Facebook page. It's DOR_NYC, and that you'll see announcements about our upcoming programs. Probably more like in January as we're planning it. And we also help plan an annual day, which is on January 30th, is Fred Korematsu Day in New York City. It's actually recognized by the city, and it honors a civil rights leader who actually fought against the incarceration when he was a young man, and his case went all the way to Supreme Court, and he was eventually ruled against, but then his case was eventually partially overturned in the early 2000s, I think. And so I invite you to come to any and all of our programs, and if you check our social media, or you can send us a message, and we'll put you on the email list and make sure you know about the different activities.
Thank you so much, Stan. And also, I just want to invite Koji Sato-san, who's the president of the Japanese American Association of New York, because I think just having this collective space is so valuable. We don't have it enough. So since he was able to make it, thank you so much. If you can just quickly share some of the work that you do.
Hi, I'm Koji Sato, president of the Japanese American Association in New York. The organization has been in existence since 1907, so it's our 116th year. Some of the activities, we are community service. Some of the recent activities we had was a Memorial Day service at the Japanese cemetery in Mount Olivet Cemetery. Our founder founded this cemetery, bought the cemetery for $2,500 in 1912 for a burial place for Japanese who didn't have family here. So that was on May 29th, we did that. We also had our scholarship dinner, which we gave about $100,000 in scholarships to college-going high school seniors and also graduate students. See some of the other activities, we're working with Stan Honda on the Tanabata Festival, which is in Carl Schurz Park on July 7th. Tanabata is a Japanese holiday where two star-crossed lovers meet on the Milky Way once a year. And so we have the Astronomers Association with a lot of telescopes on the Upper East Side in Carl Schurz Park. We also have baseball tournaments with about 16 baseball teams that play in Central Park. Golf tournament in September. Okay. We also participate in 311 events and 911 events. 311 event is the tsunami back in 10 years ago. So we collect money for that. And we also do charity work for 9/11 event as well. So those are some of the things that we participate in. If you're interested, you can look at our website, jaany.org. So thank you very much. Thank you, Alice, and thank you, Mr. Kenjima and Kim, for sharing your story, and Amy and Sarah. Great job. I've learned so much from you guys. There are many things I didn't even know that you presented. I thought I knew a lot, but you guys really taught me a lot. Thank you again.
And yes, thank you so much to Amy, Rod, the bookstore. We can't do it without them. They're the most important because they gave us the venue. Thank you so much. I also want to mention that the India Center is also here from Westchester. This is truly a collaborative space for the Asian American identity, and thank you so much for supporting it, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.